Hey everybody. I haven't done comments on the news on my YouTube channel in a while, and I have been working on, podcasts and other things when I talk to my students, especially about Russia's threatened invasion of Ukraine here. And we have a lot of interesting things going on. And to keep it short, I the working theory I have here, the thing that when I look at Russia versus NATO, basically, is the way I see it. First of all, uh, I see I'm really looking at this through the lens of selectorate theory and its ideas about the different incentive structures that exist for dictators or authoritarian leaders. In the case of Vladimir Putin, who is got a only depends on a small coalition to keep him in power, as opposed to the democratic leaders of NATO and the particularly the United States, where they depend on a large coalition. And the general prediction of selectorate theory is that dictators have a freedom of action in everything except providing private benefits to their supporters, which is the means by which they stay in power. And so as long as, and Putin presumably has set it up that he has his private supporters taken care of. And as long as they continue to be taken care of, he is free to act. And they will be loyal and follow his lead. In a democratic government, because there's so many people needed to support a leader, the leader must provide, can't buy people off with private benefits, so has to provide public goods. Generally, that means policy. They have to do a good job. When it comes to fighting wars, they need to do a good job and, do what people want, right? They do not have the freedom of action. They must do what the people want. They must, they aren't free to pick their causes and negotiate. And so, and their feet are held to the fire about how they perform. And so this creates different incentives. And Bueno de Mesquita and Smith have, in their book, Dictator's Handbook, said that, the advice of Art of War, Sun Tzu, applies to the dictators, especially in that sense. And, that advice is about being economical, about being flexible, basically being very opportunistic, and making small moves, not committing so many resources that you drain the treasury, which in selectorate theory terms would be not committing so many resources that you infringe on the private benefits of your supporters, which is why they support you. And, but it kind of describes the situation of the leader having to be economical but deft, right? And on the other side, they say that the smart advice is the Powell-Weinberger doctrine. And this general idea of, you get all your political ducks in a row. You make sure everybody has agreed that this is a good thing to do if you're going to go to war, right? And that you have the resources and everyone understands what it's going to cost, and that you get political consensus and buy-in, and then you bring it. You go and you have your very clear-cut goal and you nail that puppy, right? You bring the kitchen sink, right, with you. And very different approach, right? You're going to commit a lot of resources, and there's very little flexibility in the Powell-Weinberger doctrine. And I have a podcast where I've just wasted 4 minutes going over all that. That's the problem with this. I always have to explain the theory. But as we're looking at NATO going on and trying to do what it does in light of this threat from Putin, one thing that I find interesting is the political dialogue. And if you look at that Powell-Weinberger doctrine, and you should, the marshaling of political support is just as important as marshaling troops. And one thing that, as I'm watching this crisis, we see Russia and we see pictures of their troops massing and hear reports of troops going to Belarus. And, so we're watching those moves. And we're also watching the counter moves, right? The aid coming into Ukraine from various nations, right? And And I honestly, I think the Russians should be very concerned about how many Javelin anti-tank missiles are being given to the Ukrainian military. But that's old school. I think an important and underappreciated thing is what's happening with the political dialogue, right? Are you building up, or is Putin inadvertently building up, or are the democracies building a political consensus? How is that going? And there are signs that in fact it is going, that as these issues are coming up, there's discussion, there's more and more movement. We do see, of course, we do see things like Biden, right? Biden comes out and makes, does a press conference, and being Biden, says something stupid, right? And Biden is always, I mean, he's not as intentionally disruptive as Trump was, but Biden has always had a tendency to gaffe, right? Just to say things. And so he makes this comment, the response against Putin will depend on what he does. And there are a lot of people, one of Obama's former the Obama administration's guys just said, oh, he just gave Putin a win without Putin firing a shot, because he, NATO allies are all freaking out about what Biden said, and he's bringing disunity to the alliance. And I'm like, is he? I mean, okay, he but you saw how much the administration walked that back to where we now today in the news, there is, I believe it's Blinken saying one more Russian unit will trigger response. So the U.S. has tightened up. It's walked back from that statement and recognized. Now, what do we see in that? And this is the whole point of this video, right? What should we see in that? I would say, rather than grousing about Biden, or rather than trying to hold a standard that there should be this monolithic, unified front from NATO, and that any dissent undercuts that, I would say, look, this is evidence of the emerging debate. Biden went and made a statement, and he, for his domestic and international, supporters' purposes, right, has walked it back, right, and has said, no, wait, let me clarify. And the result of that backlash has been a tightening, right, of this, like, no, one single troop, right, there's no, and the dialogue with the Ukrainian president saying there's no such thing as a small incursion, that is working its way through the discourse, right? And so I look at that incident and say, well, one, it's the kind of crap that happens, right? But what does it tell us about the underlying political debate? And I think what it tells us is that, no, we're not, there is just a tightening under there, that they are not in the mood to be flexible as that. That point of view is not that, well, we will, if you do very little, we'll let you get away with it, is a lot less popular amongst the various political interests. And so we see a tightening, right? And we see this tightening up of things. And so I think that's the way you look at these things. Is I think a lot of times people come in and they try to present this kind of realpolitik, more Sun Tzu approach to warfare and maneuvering, and they want democracies to do it. And as I said in the podcast, and I always say with these things, look, given the two different incentive structures, the dictator is always going to outmaneuver the democracy in the short term, right? They're going to be they've got the flexibility and freedom of action that a democracy can only dream of. What a democracy's got is, if we go to war, we bring it. And the leader will be empowered, will be given everything imaginable, right? Within guidelines, but will be given a lot of resources. And this is one reason democracies win, right? Is when they go to war, they tend to, commit and suffer, right? Are willing to, really suffer. Whereas the dictator has to keep the benefits flowing to the supporters, and is only able to do what he or she can do with extra resources, right? So there's a whole economical, you do it on a shoestring. Democracies don't do anything on a shoestring when it comes to war. So this is kind of what I see happening. And so as we watch this unfold, a couple things that I see here is, watching this political dialogue and watching, will a consensus emerge amongst NATO that allowing a puppet regime to be established is not acceptable. Right now, what NATO is a group of nations that have a long-standing and formal commitment, meaning that the political ducks have been aligned around this idea that we are going to defend each other, right? And that if an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. This doesn't cover Ukraine. They're not part of NATO. No one was really thinking they were going to be part of NATO anytime soon. There were talks. There's maybe down the road, but we're not so sure about that. So the point of NATO is you can't cross one of our borders. Will NATO, and I think it's very problematic, but will a consensus emerge to be more, aggressive? Certainly, maybe not fighting, but certainly when it comes to sanctioning and other things, will they be increasingly willing to engage in costly sanctioning, costly to NATO? Are we willing to actually, cut pipelines, right, from Russia? Are we willing to cut banks out of the system, right, and do the kind of things that we did to Iran? And with Russia, there would be severe impacts on people. And, are we seeing that emerging? Are we seeing a commitment? Are we seeing a new interest in, nations like Finland? Finland and Belarus are about the only nations on the border of Russia that aren't, Poland is there. These are the others, when we look at the nations that are on the border, when you've got the four nations, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, part of NATO. What happens with Finland? What is Sweden coming around to, and is NATO growing in its strength, right, as a result of this? And this is something I think that's very important in what we're seeing. So these are things to keep an eye on. So this is what I'm thinking about. And when I watch the news, let's, keep an eye on that political resolve developing and see where that goes. How long, and the question is too, that resolve is going to grow in a path based on kind of what Putin does, right? And right now he's not doing anything, but word is leaking out about plots to replace the government. And so, the dialogue is being driven by he might do this, he might do that, in the sense of foreboding and threat. We'll see what happens, right? He has not done anything yet. Will he do anything? What does delay do to the development of this dialogue? These things are contingent, which is a fancy way of saying, the wheel weaves as the wheel will. I've been reading The Wheel of Time. So, but things are going to happen the way they're going to happen. And how they happen and how they play out is perhaps important in this evolution of consensus, but, or not. But this is, I think, the key thing that we want to be keeping our eyes on. So I hope that was interesting. Sorry to take 13 and a half minutes.